The morning of September 10, 1950, found General Douglas MacArthur staring at maps scattered across his desk in Tokyo, his weathered hands tracing the coastline of Korea. With the precision of a surgeon, outside his window, the first hints of autumn touched the Japanese capital. But MacArthur's mind was consumed by the desperate situation unfolding 300 miles away. South Korea teetered on the brink of complete collapse, its forces compressed into a tiny perimeter around the port city of Busan, while North Korean armies pressed relentlessly southward, like a steel vice closing around the last hopes of a free Korea. The Korean War had erupted just 2.5 months earlier, when Kim Il-sung's forces crossed the 38th parallel. In a massive surprise attack on June 25th, what began as a police action had quickly transformed into a full-scale war that threatened to engulf the entire peninsula. American and South Korean forces, caught off guard by the ferocity and coordination of the North Korean assault, had been forced into a series of humiliating retreats that brought them to the very edge of the Korean peninsula. MacArthur's subordinates shuffled nervously as the 70-year-old general continued his silent contemplation. They had grown accustomed to his dramatic pauses, but today felt different. The weight of an entire nation's survival hung in the balance, and conventional military wisdom suggested that their position was nearly hopeless. The Busan perimeter, a defensive line stretching roughly 100 miles from north to south along Korea's southeastern coast, was all that stood between the communist forces and complete victory. Lieutenant General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army on the ground in Korea, had managed to stabilize the perimeter through sheer determination and the timely arrival of reinforcements, but everyone knew it was a temporary reprieve. The North Korean People's Army, flush with early victories and equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, continued to probe for weaknesses in the Allied lines. Each day brought new reports of casualties, ammunition shortages, and the growing strain on troops who had been fighting without respite for weeks. Yet MacArthur saw something his critics missed. While conventional thinking focused on the immediate threat to Busan, his strategic mind was already working 3 moves ahead, like a chess grandmaster visualizing combinations that lesser players could not perceive. The very success of the North Korean advance had created an opportunity that existed only in the realm of audacious military thinking. The enemy's supply lines now stretched hundreds of miles from their bases near the Chinese border, threading through mountainous terrain that was increasingly vulnerable to disruption. The general's eyes settled on a small port city on Korea's west coast, roughly 25 miles southwest of Seoul. Inchon appeared unremarkable on the map, just another dot along the Yellow Sea coastline. But MacArthur recognized it as the key to reversing the entire strategic situation. An amphibious landing there would not only threaten the North Korean capital of Seoul, but would also sever the critical supply lines that sustained the enemy forces besieging Busan. It was a plan so bold that it bordered on the impossible, which made it perfect for a commander who had built his reputation on achieving the impossible. According to military historians at the Army War College, MacArthur had been contemplating such a landing almost from the moment North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The concept represented everything he had learned about warfare during his decades of service, from the trenches of World War I to the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific War. Success would require perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a willingness to stake everything on a single, decisive throw of the dice. The conference room at the Daiichi building in Tokyo fell silent as MacArthur unveiled his proposal to the assembled military leaders on August 23, 1950. The plan he presented seemed to defy every principle of amphibious warfare that had been painfully learned during World War II. Inchon possessed none of the characteristics that military planners typically sought in an invasion site. Instead of broad beaches suitable for landing craft, the port featured narrow channels that could accommodate only a limited number of vessels at any given time. The tidal situation at Inchon presented perhaps the most daunting challenge of all. The Yellow Sea experienced some of the most extreme tidal variations in the world, with differences of up to 30 feet between high and low tide. During low tide, The harbor became a maze of exposed mudflats stretching for miles, making any landing attempt impossible. Ships would literally run aground in the sticky mud, creating sitting ducks for enemy artillery. The narrow window of opportunity occurred only twice each month during the highest tides, leaving virtually no margin for error or delay. Admiral James Doyle, who would command the amphibious task force, listened with growing alarm as MacArthur outlined the operational requirements. The landing would need to be executed during darkness to maintain surprise, requiring precise navigation through treacherous channels. While coordinating multiple assault groups, the Marines would have to scale seawalls up to 15 feet high directly from their landing craft, carrying full combat equipment while potentially under enemy fire. It was, in Doyle's professional opinion, a recipe for disaster. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had flown from Washington specifically to hear MacArthur's presentation. Bradley represented the Pentagon's growing concern about MacArthur's increasingly independent command style and his tendency to pursue strategies that Washington found alarmingly aggressive. The Inchon proposal seemed to confirm their worst fears about MacArthur's willingness to gamble with American lives on grandiose schemes. That sounded better in theory than in practice. MacArthur, however, was just getting started. He painted a vivid picture of North Korean forces stretched thin across the peninsula, their attention focused entirely on the Pusan perimeter battle. Intelligence reports suggested that Inchon itself was lightly defended, with perhaps 2,000 North Korean troops scattered across the entire area. The element of surprise would be complete, as no sane military commander would attempt such a difficult landing when easier alternatives existed along Korea's eastern coast. The general's voice took on the cadence of a master orator as he described the strategic implications of success. A successful landing at Inchon would place American forces within striking distance of Seoul, the political and logistical heart of North Korea's entire southern campaign. More importantly, it would cut the main supply route that sustained the 14 North Korean divisions engaged around Pusan. Faced with the choice between retreating to defend their capital or fighting with diminishing supplies, the enemy would be forced into exactly the kind of desperate situation that currently plagued the United Nations forces. Critics pointed out that the landing force would be operating at the end of a precarious supply line, potentially vulnerable to counterattack from North Korean reserves. MacArthur dismissed these concerns with characteristic confidence, arguing that speed and audacity would overcome logistical challenges. The 1st Marine Division, recently arrived from the United States, would provide the assault troops, while the 7th Infantry Division would follow up to exploit the breakthrough. Together, they would constitute the 10th Corps, a force specifically organized for this operation. The meeting stretched into the evening hours. As military planners dissected every aspect of the proposed operation, intelligence officers presented detailed studies of Inchon's defenses, tidal charts, and aerial reconnaissance photographs. Navy representatives outlined the complex choreography required to land thousands of troops and their equipment within the narrow time window provided by the tides. Despite their professional reservations, gradually a consensus began to emerge that the plan, while extraordinarily risky, might actually succeed precisely because it was so audacious that no one would expect it. The transformation of the 1st Marine Division from a peacetime organization into an amphibious assault force happened with breathtaking speed during the final weeks of August 1950. Camp Pendleton in California became a hive of activity as Marines practiced scaling mock seawalls and coordinating with Navy landing craft in conditions designed to simulate the challenges they would face at Inchon. The training was intense and realistic, but nothing could fully prepare them for the unique combination of obstacles that awaited them on the Korean coast. Major General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, found himself caught between admiration for MacArthur's strategic vision and deep concern about the tactical execution. Smith had led Marines through some of the most difficult amphibious operations of World War II, and he understood better than most the countless variables that could turn a carefully planned assault into a catastrophic failure. The margin for error at Inchon was virtually non-existent. Yet his Marines would be expected to perform flawlessly under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The logistical preparations proved almost as complex as the tactical planning. Ships had to be loaded with precise timing to ensure that the right equipment would be available at the right moment during the assault. Artillery pieces, ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment, and thousands of other items needed to be positioned aboard the transport vessels in exactly the sequence they would be required ashore. A single mistake in the loading order could leave assault troops without critical support. During the most vulnerable moments of the operation, intelligence gathering took on critical importance as the operation date approached. Reconnaissance teams studied every available photograph of Inchon, analyzing the harbor defenses, identifying potential landing sites, and mapping the urban terrain that Marines would need to traverse once they got ashore. The Central Intelligence Agency, still in its infancy as an organization, provided what information it could gather about North Korean troop dispositions and defensive preparations around the target area. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding the 5th Marine Regiment, spent countless hours with his battalion commanders rehearsing the intricate timing required for success. The assault would begin before dawn on September 15th, with Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines landing on Green Beach at the northern tip of Wolmi Island. The small island controlled the approaches to Inchon Harbor and would need to be secured before the main landing could proceed. The operation required split-second coordination between air strikes, naval gunfire, and the landing craft carrying assault troops. The psychological preparation proved as important as the physical training. Marines were briefed on the strategic importance of their mission and the desperate situation of their comrades fighting around the Pusan perimeter. They understood that failure at Inchon would likely mean the complete collapse of South Korea and a humiliating defeat for the United Nations forces. The weight of these expectations created an atmosphere of grim determination throughout the division. According to contemporary reports from Time magazine, the secrecy surrounding the operation was unprecedented in American military history. Even senior officers involved in the planning were kept ignorant of details outside their immediate responsibilities. Cover stories suggested that the Marines were preparing for operations elsewhere in the Pacific, while the actual target remained known only to a handful of key commanders. The deception was so complete that many Marines did not learn their true destination until their ships were already at sea. Naval Task Force 90, commanded by Admiral Doyle, began assembling in Japanese ports during early September. The armada that would carry the assault force to Inchon included attack transports, cargo vessels, destroyers, cruisers, and the aircraft carriers that would provide air support for the landing. Coordinating the movement of so many ships while maintaining operational security required meticulous planning and no small amount of luck. The final briefings took place aboard the command ship, Mount McKinley, as the task force steamed toward Korea. MacArthur himself addressed the senior commanders, his words carrying the weight of history and the knowledge that they were about to attempt something that military textbooks would classify as impossible. The general's confidence was infectious, but underneath the stirring rhetoric lay the sobering reality that they were gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. The pre-dawn darkness of September 15th, 1950, cloaked the Yellow Sea in an eerie silence, broken only by the low rumble of ship engines and the whispered commands of Marines preparing for battle. Aboard the transport vessels of Task Force 90, thousands of American fighting men made their final preparations for an assault that would either save South Korea or end in disaster. The tidal charts showed that high tide would occur at 6:59 a.m., providing a narrow window of opportunity that would remain open for only a few precious hours. At precisely 5:30 a.m., the first wave of landing craft began their run toward Wolmi Island, a rocky outcrop that commanded the approaches to Inchon Harbor. The island's capture was essential to the success of the main landing, as its gun positions could devastate any force attempting to enter the harbor. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Taplett's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, crouched in their landing craft as naval gunfire from the cruisers Rochester and Toledo pounded the island's defenses with devastating accuracy. The Marines hit Green Beach at 6:33 a.m., exactly 26 minutes before the scheduled time, catching the North Korean defenders completely off guard. The element of surprise was so complete that many enemy soldiers were still in their bunkers. When the first Marines scrambled ashore, within minutes, the American flag was flying over the island's highest point, and the approaches to Inchon harbor were secure. The first phase of Operation Cromite, as the landing was codenamed, had succeeded beyond the most optimistic projections. As the morning tide began to recede, the main assault force prepared for the more challenging landings at Red Beach and Blue Beach within Inchon proper. The city's seawalls, some reaching 15 feet in height, presented a formidable obstacle that would require Marines to scale them directly from their landing craft while potentially under enemy fire. The narrow beaches offered little room for maneuver, and any delay in the assault schedule would leave the attacking forces trapped on the mudflats. When the tide went out, Colonel Lewis Puller, commanding the 1st Marines, watched from the command ship as his regiment prepared for the assault on Red Beach. Puller, already a legend within the Marine Corps for his actions in World War II, understood that the next few hours would determine not only the fate of his Marines, but potentially the outcome of the entire Korean War. The enemy's response to the landing would reveal whether MacArthur's gamble had been justified or whether they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The second wave of landing craft touched down at Red Beach at 5:31 p.m. Just as the evening tide reached its peak, Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, swarmed up the seawalls using ladders and ropes, establishing a foothold in the city despite scattered resistance from North Korean troops. The defenders, clearly caught unprepared by the assault, offered only sporadic resistance as the Marines advanced through the narrow streets toward their initial objectives. At Blue Beach, the 5th Marines faced stiffer opposition as they attempted to secure the southern approaches to the city. Machine gun nests positioned in buildings overlooking the landing site opened fire on the Marines as they scaled the seawalls, but concentrated naval gunfire quickly silenced most of the enemy positions. Within 2 hours of the initial landing, both beaches were secure, and American forces were advancing inland according to the carefully rehearsed plan. The speed of the advance caught even the American commanders by surprise. Intelligence estimates had suggested that Inchon was defended by approximately 2,000 North Korean troops, but the actual resistance proved to be far lighter than anticipated. Many of the enemy soldiers abandoned their positions and fled toward Seoul, rather than fight against overwhelming odds. By midnight on September 15th, the Marines had secured most of their initial objectives and were preparing to advance toward Kimpo Airfield, the key to controlling the approaches to Seoul. Radio communications with the 8th Army at Pusan confirmed that the landing had achieved its primary strategic objective almost immediately. North Korean forces attacking the Pusan perimeter suddenly found themselves fighting with reduced artillery support and dwindling ammunition supplies as their logistics network came under increasing pressure. The enemy commanders faced the nightmare scenario that MacArthur had predicted. They could either continue the assault on Pusan with diminishing resources or retreat to defend their capital city. The morning of September 16th dawned clear and cool as the 1st Marine Division began its rapid advance inland from the Inchon beachhead. The success of the initial landing had exceeded even MacArthur's optimistic projections, but the real test lay ahead in the race to capture Seoul. Before North Korean forces could organize an effective defense of their capital, speed was essential, as every hour of delay would allow the enemy to reinforce the city and potentially turn the liberation into a costly urban battle. Kimpo Airfield, located halfway between Inchon and Seoul, represented the first major objective beyond the beachhead. The airfield's capture would provide a base for tactical air support and demonstrate to the world that American forces were not merely conducting a raid, but were prepared to stay and fight for Korean freedom. The 5th Marines, advancing along the main road from Inchon, encountered scattered resistance from North Korean units that seemed more interested in delaying the advance than in making a determined stand. The psychological impact of the landing rippled across the Korean peninsula, as news of the American success spread through both military and civilian channels. South Korean forces defending the Pusan perimeter reported improved morale among their troops, while intelligence intercepts suggested growing panic among North Korean commanders who suddenly found their strategic situation reversed. The hunter had become the hunted, and the implications were becoming clear to military observers on both sides of the conflict. Major General Edward Almond, commanding the 10th Corps, established his headquarters ashore on September 17th and immediately began coordinating the advance toward Seoul. Almond, a protege of MacArthur known for his aggressive leadership style, pushed his subordinate commanders to maintain maximum pressure on the retreating North Korean forces. The window of opportunity created by the successful landing would not remain open indefinitely, and Almond understood that decisive action in the next few days could determine the ultimate outcome of the war. The 7th Infantry Division, following up the Marine assault, began landing at Inchon on September 18th and immediately moved to secure the southern approaches to Seoul. The division's mission was to prevent North Korean reinforcements from reaching the capital while the Marines advanced from the west. The coordination between the two divisions required precise timing and continuous communication, as any gap in the American lines could allow enemy forces to escape or counterattack. Combat engineers worked frantically to clear the roads and bridges leading toward Seoul, many of which had been damaged by retreating North Korean forces. The Marines' advance depended on maintaining supply lines back to Inchon, and any major obstacle could slow the offensive long enough for the enemy to establish defensive positions around the capital. The engineering challenge was complicated by the mountainous terrain, which channeled the advance along predictable routes that could be easily defended. As reported by correspondents from the Associated Press, the advance toward Seoul took on the character of a pursuit rather than a conventional assault. North Korean units, caught between the advancing 10th Corps and the pressure being applied by the 8th Army, breaking out of the Pusan perimeter, found themselves in an increasingly untenable position. Many units simply dissolved as individual soldiers abandoned their equipment and attempted to escape northward. The political implications of the American success were not lost on observers in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. The dramatic reversal of fortune in Korea demonstrated both the potential and the risks of American military intervention in the emerging Cold War. Success at Inchon would likely embolden American policymakers to take a more aggressive stance in other global confrontations, while failure would have provided ammunition for critics who argued that the United States was overextending itself in distant conflicts. By September 20th, advance elements of the 1st Marines had reached the outskirts of Seoul and were preparing for what promised to be the most challenging phase of the operation. Urban warfare required different tactics and presented unique dangers that could negate many of the advantages that American forces had enjoyed during the advance. From Inchon, the North Korean forces retreating into Seoul would likely make their most determined stand in the city's streets and buildings, where American advantages in mobility and firepower would be reduced. The battle for Seoul began in earnest on September 25, 1950, as Marines from the 1st Division encountered the first serious resistance they had faced since the Inchon landing. North Korean forces, reinforced by units retreating from other parts of the peninsula, had established defensive positions throughout the city. Using the urban terrain to maximum advantage, street fighting in Seoul would test every lesson the Marines had learned about urban warfare during World War II. While presenting new challenges unique to the Korean conflict, the narrow streets and traditional Korean architecture created a maze of potential ambush sites where small groups of defenders could delay much larger attacking forces. North Korean soldiers, many of them veterans of the Chinese Civil War, demonstrated considerable skill in urban combat tactics. They used buildings as fortified positions, forcing the Marines to clear each structure methodically while exposing themselves to sniper fire and grenades thrown from upper stories. Colonel Homer Litzenberg's 7th Marines spearheaded the assault on the northern districts of Seoul advancing block by block against determined resistance. The fighting was characterized by sudden, violent encounters followed by periods of relative quiet as both sides regrouped and prepared for the next engagement. Artillery support was limited by the close proximity of friendly forces, requiring the Marines to rely primarily on small unit tactics and individual marksmanship. The psychological warfare aspect of the battle proved as important as the physical combat. Loudspeakers mounted on Marine vehicles broadcast surrender appeals in Korean, while leaflets dropped by aircraft promised fair treatment for prisoners of war. Some North Korean units responded to these appeals, but others fought with the desperation of men who believed they had no alternative to victory or death. The result was a patchwork of resistance that made it impossible to predict where the next serious fight would occur. South Korean forces, newly equipped and reorganized under American supervision, played an increasingly important role in the Seoul operation. The symbolic significance of Korean troops participating in the liberation of their capital was not lost on political leaders in both Seoul and Washington. President Syngman Rhee, who had been forced to flee Seoul when the North Korean invasion began, prepared to return to his capital as soon as the city was secure. The coordination between Marine units and South Korean forces required careful attention to communication and command relationships. Language barriers and differences in tactical doctrine created potential sources of confusion that could prove fatal in urban combat. American advisors worked closely with South Korean commanders to ensure that operations were coordinated effectively, while Marine units shared intelligence and provided fire support when requested. Naval gunfire support from ships in the Yellow Sea provided a crucial advantage for the attacking forces. Despite the challenges of firing into an urban environment, the cruiser Rochester and destroyer flotillas provided precise bombardment of specific targets, identified by forward observers, helping to suppress North Korean strongpoints that might otherwise have required costly frontal assaults. The accuracy of naval gunfire in urban terrain demonstrated the advances in fire control technology that had been developed since World War II. According to coverage by war correspondents from major American newspapers, the fighting in Seoul revealed both the strengths and limitations of North Korean forces. While individual soldiers often fought with courage and determination, the command structure showed signs of breakdown under the pressure of the American advance. Communication between units became increasingly difficult as American forces cut telephone lines and radio interference increased. The tide of battle turned decisively on September 27th when Marine reconnaissance units discovered that North Korean forces were beginning to withdraw from the city center. The enemy's retreat was covered by rear-guard actions designed to delay the American advance, but the overall pattern was clear. Organized resistance in Seoul was collapsing. The question became whether North Korean forces would be able to conduct an orderly withdrawal or would be forced to abandon their equipment and flee in disorder. By September 28th, American and South Korean forces had secured most of Seoul's government district and were advancing toward the Han River, which marked the traditional boundary between Seoul and the countryside to the north. The liberation of Seoul was nearly complete, representing not only a tactical victory but a strategic triumph that would reshape the entire Korean conflict and establish the foundation for the event. Yule Armistice negotiations, the morning of September 29th, 1950, witnessed scenes of celebration throughout Seoul as the last North Korean resistance collapsed and American forces completed their occupation of the South Korean capital. The speed of the victory had surprised even MacArthur's most optimistic projections, transforming what many had predicted would be a costly urban battle into a decisive triumph that demonstrated the power of bold strategic thinking combined with superior tactical execution. The liberation of Seoul represented far more than just the recapture of a city. It marked the complete reversal of the strategic situation that had existed just 2 weeks earlier. North Korean forces, which had appeared on the verge of conquering the entire peninsula, now found themselves trapped between the advancing 10th Corps and the 8th Army, which had broken out of the Pusan perimeter and was advancing northward with renewed confidence. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and the implications would resonate throughout the Cold War. General MacArthur's triumphant return to Seoul on September 29th provided a dramatic conclusion to one of the most audacious military operations in American history, standing in the same government building where he had accepted the Japanese surrender. 5 years earlier, MacArthur formally restored the South Korean government to its capital and declared the operation a complete success. The general's words carried the weight of vindication for a strategy that had been criticized as impossibly risky by many of his contemporaries. The human cost of the Inchon operation proved remarkably light considering the magnitude of the achievement. American casualties totaled fewer than 200 killed and wounded, while North Korean losses were estimated in the thousands. The disparity reflected not only the element of surprise, but also the superior training, equipment, and leadership that characterized the American forces. The Marines and soldiers who had executed the landing could take pride in having achieved what military historians would later call a perfect amphibious operation. The strategic consequences of the victory extended far beyond the Korean peninsula. The success at Inchon demonstrated that American military power could project decisive force across vast distances and achieve objectives that seemed impossible through conventional means. This lesson would influence American strategic thinking for decades to come, sometimes with beneficial results and sometimes with tragic consequences. As policymakers became overly confident in the ability of military force to achieve political objectives, the North Korean retreat from Seoul quickly became a rout as units that had maintained their cohesion during the fighting in the city dissolved under the pressure of continuous American air attacks and the demoralization that followed their strategic defeat. Thousands of North Korean soldiers surrendered rather than attempt the dangerous journey back across the 38th parallel, while others simply abandoned their equipment and attempted to blend in with the civilian population. The timing of the victory proved crucial to its long-term impact on the Korean War. The success at Inchon occurred just as Chinese leaders were debating whether to intervene in the conflict to prevent a complete North Korean collapse. The dramatic American success may have convinced Beijing that intervention was necessary to prevent American forces from establishing themselves on China's border, setting the stage for the massive Chinese offensive that would transform the conflict into a much larger and more prolonged war. President Harry Truman's decision to authorize the Inchon landing, despite serious reservations from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, represented one of the most important command decisions of the early Cold War period. The success vindicated Truman's judgment and demonstrated the importance of presidential leadership in military affairs, while also illustrating the risks inherent in approving operations that carry enormous potential for both success and failure. The liberation of Seoul marked the high point of American success in the Korean War, but it also created the conditions that would lead to Chinese intervention and the transformation of what began as a limited conflict into a much larger war. The victory at Inchon would be remembered as a brilliant tactical achievement that demonstrated the continuing relevance of bold leadership and innovative thinking in modern warfare, while also serving as a reminder that military success must be followed by wise political decisions to achieve lasting strategic objectives. As the American flag was raised once again over the South Korean capital, few of the celebrating soldiers and Marines could have imagined that their triumph would prove to be temporary or that the Korean peninsula would remain divided for decades to come. The Battle of Inchon had saved South Korea from collapse and demonstrated the power of American military innovation, but it had also set in motion events that would shape the Cold War and define the limits of American power in the nuclear age.